You think you know ancient Egyptian warfare from movies? Try this. Close your eyes. Feel the brutal 50-degree heat. Taste the sand in your teeth. Hear the guy next to you praying to God while peeing himself. Now open them. That's your first battle. No golden armor, no slow-motion charges, just chaos, panic, and the desperate hope your sandals don't fall off. Let's take a look at what the movies won't show you. For most Egyptians, military service was a nightmare that started in the fields and ended in chaos. Imagine being pulled away from your barley crop, handed a bronze sickle sword, and told you'll be fighting Nubians by sunset. Pharaoh didn't care if you'd ever held a weapon before. He needed bodies, not warriors. Historical records from Deir el-Medina show that most soldiers were farmers with more experience sowing seeds than wielding spears. Their so-called training manual? More or less, stab the other guy before he stabs you. These men had spent their lives bent over irrigation ditches, not learning to march in formation. Suddenly, they found themselves in stiff linen armor, squinting through sweat while officers barked orders in dialects they barely recognized. Papyrus documents describe conscripts holding weapons upside down, slicing their own legs with khopesh swords, and forgetting which end of the spear was sharp. It was like watching a group of tax collectors try to play rugby with knives. Training, if you could call it that, lasted maybe 3 days. Soldiers' letters from Gebeline mention recruits practicing formations by marking grids in the dirt, just as the Gebeline letters describe, until someone's donkey wandered through and ruined the lines. Then it was straight into real combat, carrying 50 pounds of gear and no idea what to expect. The man next to you might have smelled like fermented fish, but you were too busy trying not to drop your shield to care. Field conditions made everything worse. Try remembering your drill commands when it's 50 degrees and your linen armor is glued to your skin with sweat. Some tomb paintings, probably meant to show glory, accidentally reveal the truth. Farmers turn soldiers, cowering in ditches, while officers whack them with sticks to get them moving. Modern reenactments show that untrained groups fall apart within 90 seconds of simulated combat. Now add real bronze weapons and the threat of death. Draft notices came from local officials, who rounded up every able-bodied man they could find. Hittite prisoners wrote about Egyptian units where half the soldiers couldn't even understand each other. Surviving rosters from the Ramesside period list men like livestock: 20 from P. Ramses, 15 with eye infections, 3 missing toes. Unless you could bribe someone, you were going. One peasant's petition from Lahoun begged Pharaoh, "My wife is sick. My goats will starve. Please don't make me fight the sea peoples." He got drafted anyway. If you were lucky, you got trampled by a chariot early. The rest learned that farming skills didn't save you when the fighting started. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, you realized the real problem might be the weapon in your hand. That curved bronze khopesh might have looked impressive in a temple display case, but out on a battlefield, it had a bad habit of letting you down. Bronze weapons were the IKEA furniture of ancient warfare. Nice to look at, but after a few real hits, things got ugly. Modern metallurgists testing replica blades found severe bending after just 5 clashes with shields. Swing at a Hittite's shield for the 10th time, and you'd see your sword sag like a wilted lettuce leaf. Archaeologists keep finding weapons from Egyptian battle sites twisted into bizarre shapes. There's a mass grave near Megiddo full of swords bent at right angles, so mangled you can't even tell if they started out as daggers or sickles. One khopesh dug up from the Battle of Kadesh looks like someone tried to pry open a storage jar with it. That's what happened when soft bronze met armor or another blade. Experienced fighters learned to avoid direct blade-on-blade contact because they knew their weapons couldn't handle it. If your sword bent in the middle of a fight, you had to improvise. Some soldiers just used the damaged weapon as a club or tried stabbing with whatever straight bit was left. Tomb paintings show men gripping broken spear shafts like baseball bats, while others just started throwing rocks when nothing else worked. At the Battle of Jahi, records mention desperate soldiers grabbing enemy weapons off the ground when theirs failed, like a deadly version of musical chairs where the loser didn't get a second chance. Officers had an advantage. Their weapons were better made, with more tin in the bronze, giving them a harder edge. For regular conscripts, though, weapons came from rushed wartime production. Analysis of battlefield relics shows that hurried casting often left blades with weak spots. Try explaining to your squad that your sword snapped because the blacksmith was in a hurry. Even if your weapon didn't break, it dulled fast in the desert. After a few minutes of hacking at shields and armor, your blade went from razor sharp to blunt crowbar. And the weight didn't help. A 3-foot khopesh could weigh around 4 pounds, and after swinging it under the sun, your arms would feel like wet laundry hanging off your shoulders. Bronze was expensive too. Lose your weapon, and you risked a flogging. That's why some soldiers clung to bent, useless swords rather than return empty-handed. Graves sometimes show men buried with several battered weapons, probably gathered from fallen comrades just to avoid punishment. Egyptians knew about iron weapons from their enemies, but they stuck with bronze for centuries. Tradition mattered more than survival. Bronze looked good in victory carvings and reflected sunlight for the priests. But out in the real world, it cost lives. And as bad as your weapon was, the armor you wore brought its own set of problems. Linen armor looked impressive in the artwork, crisp, white folds that made every conscript look ready for parade day. But once you put it on, reality hit fast. 15 glued layers of flax sounded smart until you stood in the midday sun, packed shoulder to shoulder with other terrified farmers. Modern replica tests show that inside this armor, temperatures soared well over 120 degrees within minutes. The glue holding everything together would turn mushy from sweat and heat, leaving you feeling like you'd been wrapped in boiling wet cardboard. Soldiers complained about the armor sticking to their skin, and tomb paintings show men trying to peel it off their backs during battle. Some accounts mention troops ripping the stuff off mid-fight, deciding they'd rather risk arrows than pass out from heat stroke. And honestly, it wasn't much protection anyway. Linen could stop a glancing arrow at a distance, but couldn't withstand direct hits. Archaeologists have found mass graves with arrows lodged deep beneath where the armor should have kept men safe. Some skeletons show several wounds in the same spot, proof that enemies quickly figured out the weak points. The heat did more than make you miserable. Modern recreations show heart rates spiking dangerously high in linen armor after just 30 minutes of movement. One volunteer in England passed out after 40 minutes in replica gear, and that was in cool weather, not the Egyptian summer. Real soldiers fought for hours, dehydrated and terrified, their armor clinging to them like a second soggy skin. Caring for the armor was almost as bad as wearing it. Brief washing in the Nile dissolved the glue, so armor often ended battles soggy and useless. Soldiers who tried to clean theirs found it would fall apart or stiffen into boards. Most just wore it again and again, letting sweat and blood build up until the stench was enough to clear a room. Officers and the wealthy got better options: leather scales or imported bronze. Everyone else made do with whatever the quartermaster handed out, even if the stitching was crooked or the layers didn't line up. Chafing was constant. Linen stiffened when dirty, rubbing skin raw until men bled from their armpits and necks before they even saw the enemy. Ancient medical papyri describe treating infected armor sores, a slow, miserable way to die far from any glory. The cruel joke was that Egypt's elite troops, the ones guarding pharaohs, often went without armor at all. They understood that in this heat, staying mobile was the only real defense. But for the average conscript, there was no choice. Get in line, suit up, and hope you made it through the day. And as if all that wasn't enough, the battlefield threw even more surprises at these men, ones that no amount of armor could prepare them for. Forget the movie scenes of Egyptian chariots gliding smoothly across the sand. In real battles, chariots were more like demolition derby cars, lightweight, fast, and prone to disaster. We're talking about 45 pounds of wood and leather that could tip over if you hit a rock at the wrong angle. Archaeological remains from Megiddo show more wrecked chariots from potholes and rough patches than from enemy weapons. Visibility was a nightmare. Once a chariot started kicking up dust, the crew was basically charging blind, hoping not to crash into a hidden obstacle. Ancient accounts describe wheels catching on uneven ground and sending both driver and archer flying, sometimes right into their own horses. It was chaos, and the dust only made things worse. The horses didn't help. Egyptian war horses weren't calm under pressure. Papyrus notes how horses bolted sideways at clanging shields, sending crews flying. Some paintings show crews barely hanging on as their horses rear up or veer off course. Modern experiments with replica chariots prove that even skilled riders struggle to control the horses at full speed, especially once battle noise kicks in. Chariots themselves were fragile. The joints were leather, and the heat made them stretch, so wheels wobbled and sometimes fell off. Archaeologists keep finding shattered chariot wheels and broken axles scattered across battlefields. Some graves even have drivers buried with wood splinters still in their ribs from crashes. The so-called lightweight design was great until you hit a bump and the whole thing collapsed. Teamwork in a chariot was its own problem. A driver and an archer had to coordinate every move while dodging obstacles and enemy fire. Surviving letters recall shouting matches. Turn left. No, right. And then a perfect 3-chariot pileup. Hittite records mock Egyptian chariots for getting tangled together like fish in a net. Even when everything worked, chariots weren't good everywhere. They were great for chasing down fleeing enemies or flanking, but useless in close combat. Records from Kadesh mention chariots getting stuck in piles of bodies, with horses refusing to move forward. Crews sometimes had to abandon their chariots and fight on foot, if they survived the crash landing. The aftermath was ugly. A flipped chariot could take out anyone nearby, and panicked horses would drag wreckage through friendly lines, tripping other soldiers. Paintings at Luxor even show chariots on their sides while troops scramble to get out of the way. Keeping chariots battle-ready was another headache. Wheels warped in storage, axles cracked, and armory records are full of complaints about repairs. Some crews went into battle knowing their chariot might collapse at any moment, but the alternative, desertion, meant death. Pharaoh's carvings always show neat chariot lines, but dig up a real battlefield and you'll find chariot parts scattered everywhere. In the dust and chaos, order vanished fast, and the real danger sometimes came from your own side. Trying to hold formation in a dust storm so thick you can't see your own feet is bad enough. Then the guy next to you screams, "Was that an enemy attack or just panic?" You swing your khopesh blindly and feel it hit something soft. Turns out it was your squad mate. Friendly fire wasn't just an accident in Egyptian battles, it was shockingly common. Archaeologists at Megiddo estimate about 1 in 5 wounds was self-inflicted. That's a lot of soldiers taken out by their own side. The confusion started with everyone looking almost identical. Linen armor, maybe a bronze helmet if you were lucky. In the chaos, you'd try to tell friend from foe based on which direction they ran. But as soon as formations broke, which happened fast. Men ended up stabbing anyone running the same way. Letters found at Deir el-Medina mentioned desperate shouts of, "Wait, I'm on your side," right before someone got speared. It didn't help that the battlefield was a swirling mess of dust and grit, kicked up by chariots and thousands of feet, turning everything into a sandstorm with weapons. Visibility dropped to zero within minutes. Modern recreations show that in these conditions, you could barely identify who was next to you, let alone who was coming at you with a blade. Tomb paintings, probably meant to show heroic action, accidentally reveal soldiers stabbing at shadows while their own men flee behind them. Weapons didn't make things easier. Most Egyptian troops used the same khopesh swords and bronze-tipped spears, so when a blade came at you through the haze, you had a split second to decide, friend or foe. Most chose to swing first and hope for the best. Mass graves from battle sites contain bodies with multiple stab wounds to the back, not from enemies, but from their own side trying to help. Officers weren't immune to mistakes either. Records describe elite guards accidentally flanking their own troops. At the Battle of Kadesh, Egyptian commanders famously ordered reserves to attack what they thought was the enemy rear. It was actually their own chariot force returning from patrol. The result? A pile of Egyptian corpses killed by Egyptian arrows. Pharaoh Ramses II's official scribes left that part out. Panic only made things worse. One soldier screaming, "They're behind us!" could set off a wave of accidental stabbings as men spun around, swinging wildly. Medical papyri describe bizarre wounds. Men stabbed upward through the chin or speared under the arm, all from panicked comrades reacting to shadows. After the battle, the truth was hard to face. Some soldiers only realized they'd killed friends after the dust settled. Units sometimes refused to camp together, afraid of revenge. Veterans covered up friendly fire by claiming the dead fell bravely against the enemy. Pharaoh's scribes worked hard to erase these mistakes, listing neat rows of enemy dead and showing perfect battles in wall carvings. But archaeologists know better. The real story is in the graves and the wounds they found, messy, accidental, and all too human. Of course, if you thought getting stabbed by your own side was the worst part of Egyptian warfare, you haven't considered what it was actually like to stand in the middle of thousands of unwashed soldiers under the desert sun. Let's talk about a weapon Hollywood never shows: the smell. Egyptian warfare wasn't just about swords and chariots. It was about enduring the stench of thousands of men packed together under the desert sun. Forget the idea of crisp, clean armies. The odor hung heavy over every battlefield. Modern tests estimate each soldier's stench could spread up to 15 feet. Now multiply that by an entire army, and you get the ancient world's version of chemical warfare. It started with what they ate. Egyptian soldiers lived on a steady diet of garlic, onions, and fermented fish paste. Their sweat carried those smells everywhere. After months of marching and fighting with no chance to bathe, men reeked worse than rotten melons left out in the sun. Letters from Deir el-Medina complain about units being able to smell their own comrades coming from far away, long before they could see them. Their armor didn't help. Linen and wool soaked up sweat and oils like sponges. After weeks in the same gear, the armor became what one scribe called the stink of the underworld. Modern experiments show linen armor could hold hundreds of times its weight in sweat and bacteria. So every soldier was basically fighting inside a mobile petri dish, and the heat only made things worse. As temperatures rose, the stench got thicker. Some soldiers said it was so strong you could taste it, a mix of rancid fat, sour milk, and decaying meat. There are even accounts of troops vomiting before battle started, just from the collective odor. The enemy noticed too. Hittite records sneer that Egyptian armies made the wind change direction. Wind mattered more than tactics some days. Armies tried to position themselves upwind so their stink would blow toward the enemy. There are stories of opposing forces retreating when the wind shifted and they caught a full blast of Egyptian body odor. One Nubian inscription even boasts about a victory where the enemy fled from their smell before their spears. It got worse up close. Hand-to-hand combat meant you weren't just fighting for your life. You were gagging on month-old garlic breath and sweat. Medical papyri mention men passing out from inhaling enemy body odor at close range. And animal baggage trains doubled the odor problem and brought clouds of disease-spreading flies. The aftermath lingered, dead bodies baked in the sun, making the battlefield reek for days. Soldiers on cleanup detail wrote about the smell clinging to their skin for weeks. Some records even suggest burning clothes after a fight because the stink wouldn't come out. You won't see any of this in temple carvings or museum displays, but dig up a real battlefield and you'll find mass graves with cloth pressed over mouths and noses, not for ritual, but to keep out the smell. And just when you thought the worst was over, surviving the battle brought a whole new set of problems. Victory in ancient Egypt didn't look like a parade or a feast. Once the fighting stopped, what came next was a mess nobody wanted to remember. The first thing soldiers did was loot the dead. There was no order, just a desperate scramble over corpses that had been roasting in the sun for hours. Letters from soldiers talk about maggots crawling in the armor as they tried to strip it off dead enemies. Sometimes, they'd even take the blood-soaked tunics, because anything was better than the sweat-soaked rags they'd worn through the battle. Thirst became a bigger enemy than swords. After hours in the heat, men drank from whatever puddles or leftover supplies they could find. Medical papyri mention whole units getting sick after battles, with dysentery spreading fast through ranks when soldiers drank contaminated water. Some died slower, more miserable deaths from disease than they would have on the field. Tomb paintings that were supposed to show victory sometimes reveal the truth. Exhausted troops doubled over and vomiting while officers looked the other way. Infection finished off plenty more. Bronze weapons left messy wounds that festered in the heat. Doctors oscillated from moldy bread poultices that sometimes worked to dung dressings that never did. Archaeologists find skeletons with bones scarred by infection, proof that some men lingered for weeks before sepsis finished the job. One medical papyrus even describes scraping out rot from wounds, a treatment that sounds as painful as the injury itself. Most of the loot wasn't worth the risk. Soldiers picked through bodies for cheap copper amulets, broken blades, or anything that might trade for a scrap of bread. One letter complains about finding 3 copper rings and a sack full of lice. Others got caught stealing officers' shares and ended up flogged with the very items they tried to take. Then came cleanup. Units drew straws to see who would bury the dead, which meant hauling bloated bodies that sometimes burst open when moved. The smell clung for weeks, no matter how often you tried to wash it off. Ancient medical texts suggest rubbing onions on your hands afterward, which did nothing except add another layer of stink. The battle didn't end in your head either. Nightmares haunted the survivors. Some veterans woke up screaming, still feeling hands grabbing at them. Others couldn't eat meat because it reminded them of battlefield wounds. Doctors prescribed opium and beer, but that just made the dreams stranger. Even officers didn't get much glory. Reward ceremonies meant standing for hours in blood-caked armor, sometimes passing out from heat stroke during the celebration. Bringing loot to the pharaoh often meant hauling disease-ridden junk through crowded temples. The best reward most men got was a patch of useless land or a return to farm life, right where they started, until the next draft. The monuments and temple walls told a different story, full of neat lines and heroic victories. But anyone who'd actually been there knew the truth behind those carved scenes. The official story was always polished. The reality, what happened after the fighting, wasn't something the pharaohs wanted remembered. On the temple walls, you see perfect formations and fearless pharaohs, every enemy falling in neat lines under the gaze of the gods. But the people who actually survived those battles knew the truth was far messier. The official records love to throw out big numbers: 10,000 enemy slain, 50 chariots captured. But the reality was nobody on the ground could count anything in the chaos. Letters from Deir el Medina have soldiers admitting they couldn't even tell which way was forward, let alone who they were fighting. Take Ramses Tenu at Kadesh. The temple reliefs show Ramses thundering into battle, Hittites falling like dominoes, his army in perfect order behind him. But the Hittite scribes who watched it happen wrote about Egyptian troops breaking ranks and running in panic until reinforcements finally showed up. Both sides do agree on one thing: Ramses got himself surrounded because he charged ahead without backup. The official version calls it a heroic last stand. The real story? He had to be dragged out by his own bodyguards while shouting for help. The exaggerations didn't stop there. Pharaohs sometimes ordered victories carved on temple walls even when the real enemy escaped. In some cases, they listed enemies no one else ever mentioned, probably just local rebels with new names to make the battle seem grander. Scribes recycled prisoner counts, swapping out location names to pad the records. The numbers look good on stone, but if you check the details, it's clear they were making things up as they went along. Then there's the matter of rewards. Carvings show pharaohs handing out gold and glory, but payroll records from places like Gebeline tell a different story. Common soldiers got paid in grain and old sandals, while officers pocketed the gold. One soldier's complaint survives: "They promised Syrian bronze, gave me a cracked pot." The glory always flowed upward. Medical care was another place where the propaganda fell apart. The carvings show battlefield surgeons working miracles, but medical texts show more fighters died of infections than of wounds. Treatments ranged from honey and moldy bread that sometimes helped to dung dressings that never did. Archaeologists find graves full of men who survived the battle only to die slowly from infected wounds and broken bones that never healed right. Even the so-called acts of the gods got a rewrite. One letter from a soldier describes a sandstorm that saved his unit from certain death. The official account? Pharaoh prayed to a moon and called down the winds. Another scribe claimed the gods made the enemy turn on each other, when in reality, the enemy just got drunk and started fighting among themselves. Some victories were so divine that scribes simply copied old stories, changing the names to fit the latest pharaoh. The equipment gap was just as real. Carvings show rows of well-armed soldiers, but armory records sometimes list 3 men sharing a single spear. Quartermasters complained about recruits arriving with nothing but sharpened farm tools. You won't see that in any temple mural. And if you're looking for the truth about what happened after the fighting, don't trust the neat piles of enemy weapons and smiling prisoners in the reliefs. Veteran accounts talk about flies swarming the dead, looters vomiting from the smell, and men losing their minds from thirst. None of that made it onto the walls. So next time you see an Egyptian war carving, remember, it's ancient propaganda, airbrushed, polished, and miles away from the real experience. What mattered wasn't the story carved in stone, but what the survivors remembered when they made it home. So that's the dirty truth about Egyptian warfare. No glory, just sweating farmers praying they'd make it home to their goats. Next time you see a shiny movie battle, remember the reality: bent swords, armor that cooked you alive, and more friendly fire than anyone wants to admit. Turns out, even pharaohs couldn't turn sweat and chaos into glory. If you want more history unvarnished, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because real battles never look like Hollywood. For those farmers, victory was simply making it back alive.